If this thing goes to the front line and it sees action, it is going to be an extremely capable vehicle. I mean, it is, I would say, more capable than anything the Ukrainians are currently using. So Challenger 2 is a post-Cold War design. Well, technically, I guess you can argue it, but it is a fourth generation tank. It's very good. What's important is the fire control system and the thermal system. These are things that are not available to most of the Russian fielded vehicles. Even the upgraded ones, a lot of the T-80s that are out there, some of the later T-70s. Now, don't get me wrong, some of the Russian equipment does have thermals and pretty good fire control systems. But you also have the issue that it's a 45-ton tank, and you're going up against a 70-ton tank with a pretty good gun. So what's going to happen is, assuming that the crew are good, the British tank, the Challenger, is going to see the enemy first, shoot the enemy first, and then kill him first. And that is the advantage. Plus, it is also more or less immune. I'm not going to say entirely immune, because there's always exceptions. And real life has a history of showing the mechanics wrong, that yes, you can kill this. But Challenger 2 will take a couple of knocks from a Russian 125 and keep fighting. Whereas the Russian tank, when it takes a 120, I wouldn't put my money on it surviving. Challenger 2 is the current main battle tank of the British Army, and it's also used by Oman, the only export customer. It is one of the heavier of the MBTs used in the Western world. It's quite well protected and has a pretty good reputation, albeit it has only seen combat in the Iraq conflict in 2003 and onwards. The purpose of the MBT is mobile, protected firepower. It is able to engage anything found on the battlefield. It is intended to survive hits from pretty much anything found on the battlefield. It's not invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination, but it is very well protected. And indeed, in Iraq, there were instances of Challenger 2s being hit repeatedly and continuing on to fight. It's not the most modern tank in the world anymore, and this is why the British Army has decided to upgrade it to the Challenger 3 standard with the German NATO compatible 120mm smoothbore gun. It's kind of unique in that it uses a rifled cannon, which the British have historically always liked to use for a couple of different reasons. Not least also it has a little bit wider range of ammunition you can fire from it, particularly the Hesh round, a high explosive squash head. And what that does is it's sort of a soft high explosive that squishes onto a target and then detonates. Used against buildings or armored vehicles as desired. That can't be fired by one of the NATO standard guns, such as found on the German Leopard, on the American M1, or the French Leclerc. The disadvantage is that, well, it's a very, very unique munition, which means that you have to set up a specific ammunition supplies line inside your army in order to operate it. And that's one of the reasons why the British have decided to go to the NATO standard 120 in the Challenger 3. One of the other advantages the Challenger has is it's got a thermal imaging system. It's called the TOGS, the Thermal Observation and Gunnery Sight. And that's the little box that you see on top of the gun on the 120 on the Challenger 2. And that allows you to see and fight very effectively at night. Although it doesn't have an equivalent system for the commander as a lot of the other modern tanks do. Again, that is one of the upgrades in the Challenger 3 program. As for what it does on the battlefield, it is part of a combined arms force. So it is supposed to go in conjunction with infantry supported by artillery, aviation, all the modern assets of a warfighting function. And basically it will destroy anything it meets. It's the fundamental purpose of the tank. So if it meets armored vehicles, it will use a fin round. A discarding sabot would be the American term. And it is basically a big metal dart that punches into one side of the tank and makes a mess inside. Or it can fire, as I say, the Hesh round, high explosive round, to deal with softer targets. There may also be canister or smoke rounds for use accordingly. It is a general purpose vehicle. It cannot clear terrain. It needs infantry to do it. Like any tank, it will be vulnerable to the sides or rear or even top in a built-up area. So you do want to go with infantry there as well. And it is basically, you'd want to mix what we in America would call a company team. So you'd want let's say a platoon of tanks with one or two platoons of infantry to make a nice even balance. The two will complement each other. The tank will deal with things that the infantry can't, and the infantry will deal with things that the tank can't.
So how significant do you think it is that these are being supplied to Ukraine?
More of a political than a military significance, I would say. So If I were a Ukrainian sustainer, I'd be pulling my hair out because there is nothing in the Ukrainian system which uses anything in company with what a Challenger 2 has. No spare parts, even the ammunition, it's gone, the coaxial, the 7.62mm ammunition, that's NATO standard, that the Ukrainians can use. But they have to start up an entirely new supply line for everything. Plus, there is the minor matter that Challenger 2 is an extremely heavy vehicle. So the Ukrainian tanks are generally in the 45 to 50 ton range, the T-64s, T-72s, and anything else that they've been able to grab. When you start talking about Challenger 2, and to a lesser extent the Leopard, which has been talked about as well, you're talking about restricting a lot of the mobility that you have, because not every bridge in Eastern Europe is rated for a 65 to 70 ton tank, depending on what armor modules you put on it. That also means that if you have to get across certain rivers, you need to have sustainment and support functions such as bridge layers. And the British Army has bridge layers based off of Challenger 2, specifically designed to get a 70-ton tank from one side of a relatively small river to another side of a relatively small river. Another problem you have is that the tanks are going to get stuck. Maybe they will be immobilized by enemy action, by mines. The driver might just fall off the edge of a road or something like that, and you need to get it out. And again, there are special recovery vehicles based off of the tank chassis, and the British Army has one, again, specifically designed off of the Challenger chassis, to pull these 70-ton tanks out of whatever trouble that they got into and set them to rights, or drag them back to a maintenance area where they can be repaired. So when you're talking about putting just 10 tanks, I think that's the number currently being discussed, that's basically a Ukrainian company without any attrition reserve. So if one breaks down, or if one is immobilized or lost, your company is already under strength with no backup to replace it. Now, don't get me wrong, if this thing goes to the front line and it sees action, it is going to be an extremely capable vehicle. I mean, it is, I would say, more capable than anything the Ukrainians are currently using. But you've got to have the engine is entirely new, the suspension units are entirely new, the observation system, that if something breaks in the thermal sight, is entirely new. You have to have all these spare parts in the supply line. And if you use a tank, it's going to break down. That's the way these things happen. So the Ukrainians, if they take these 10 tanks, are going to have to set up an entirely new chain to keep this thing running. And I'm not sure, for the sake of that small number, it's really worth it for them. I wouldn't be surprised if they were kept, almost just for PR purposes. The important thing about it, though, is that somebody's actually sending modern 70-ton tanks to Ukraine. So at least Ukraine could say, yes, we can use these sort of things. Please give us more. And then all of a sudden there's the argument for sending the Leopards or the M1s or whatever else any other country decides that they want to send. And if you look at, I think Poland announced today that they're willing to send in conjunction with other countries, which means that you're talking about 40 to 50 tanks, let's say. That's enough for a battalion, plus some attrition reserve. That is worth it for the Ukrainians. But if it takes the British to donate these 10 tanks to open the floodgates, then I'm sure the Ukrainians will take it.
The British are planning on sending around 10, possibly. They're discussing the idea of sending around 10 tanks. How big of an impact can 10 tanks make, even if they are quite impressive weapons? In the grand scale of the war, is that a significant number of tanks in terms of how tanks would usually operate as a battalion or as a group?
Realistically, no. We're looking at how many thousands of armoured vehicles have been destroyed so far. They are tough to knock out, but they can be knocked out. Or they will break down or whatever. So those 10 tanks will attrit over time and will get smaller. Now, the other thing about tanks is you always want to use them as a concentration. So you don't send 3 here and 3 there and 3 over yonder. You keep them together, and if you are going to use these 10 tanks in the front line, it would be in conjunction with other armoured vehicles that the Ukrainians already have. So let's say you have a company of Challenger 2s, and then a couple of companies of T-64s to the left and the right. So the Challengers would be the heavy hitters, shall we say, whilst much of the work is actually done by the supporting assets, the T-64s, the infantry in their BTRs, or whatever infantry system. I believe the Germans were talking about sending mortars, for example. The Americans were using Bradleys. They would all have to work together. The Challenger 2 would then be a force multiplier more than a war-winning thing in itself. That's assuming, again, that you can get the 10, so only 10 tanks to the front with its sustainment assets.
In terms of you saying that the Russians might have quite limited capability in how they can actually combat this tank, how they would be able to destroy it, do they have any sort of set ways for dealing with these tanks? Is there something they can use specifically against it, or is it kind of a throw what they have and see what works situation?
It's more like a throw what you have and see what works. I mean, a tank is a tank. When a lot of gamers, for example, will come up with different tactics against certain types of tank, but war isn't a war game. I mean, everybody should know that. And if what you have is, let's say, an AT-14, and there's a tank out there, you're going to shoot your AT-14 at the tank. Any tank you will prefer to shoot at the side or the back, because that's where the armor is always least. And there are very, very few tanks out there where there isn't a very significant difference in armor protection between the front and the sides. Now, whether or not the sides of Challenger 2, which are fairly well armored, is in reality, in practical terms, any more vulnerable to most of the equipment, that's an answer I cannot give you. I'm sure the British security services will probably have words with me, even if I did know and tell you. And the only way to find out is going to be to shoot at one and see what happens. And I've no doubt that if this thing does go to the front line, somebody will shoot at it, and we'll find out what happens. But as a tanker, if you're in the Challenger 2, you don't want to be shot at from the side. But if you're in an Abrams, you don't want to be shot at from the side. If you're in a T-64, you don't want to be shot at from the sides. So the practical difference in terms of what happens on the battlefield is negligible. It's just a matter of, does the weapon work or does it not?
Mm-hmm. And in terms of some of the other vehicles that are being provided by NATO and NATO allies, we've heard as well that the Biden administration is sending 50 Bradley fighting vehicles. Germany is apparently going to provide 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. France, we've heard, is going to be giving the AMX-10 RC, as well as Bastion armoured personnel carriers. What sort of impact are these vehicles going to make?
More of one, that I would say, than 10 Challenger tanks. Because for starters, you're talking about battalion-sized organizations. 50 Bradleys is going to give you a full battalion that you can mechanize with a very good fire control system. So it's better than most of what the Ukrainians or the Russians have. Even though the Marder and Bradley are, at this point, starting to become relatively old themselves. But for the Bradley, for example, you're talking about a fully stabilized, thermal-equipped 25mm autocannon that is extremely dangerous. In the Gulf War, the Bradleys were killing tanks. In fact, the Bradleys killed more tanks than the American tanks did. These are not things to be taken lightly. Plus, they have anti-tank missile systems on their own as well. And their job is to carry the troops. So you now have a full mechanized battalion going around in Bradleys or in Marders with very good sights. And really, I think today it all comes down to the sights. Do you have the thermal sight? If you do, you have a significant advantage over somebody who doesn't. And they are in sufficient numbers that it is worthwhile to field them and to set up the sustainment and to train the mechanics and to have the 10 spare engines for 50 vehicles. That's worth it. And
I understand as well, in the Gulf War, the Challenger, or previous version of the Challenger, has kind of faced off against these T-72 tanks before. Are you aware of that? Do you think there's any sort of history between the sort of tanks that Russia will be fielding and the Challenger, and what we could learn from that maybe?
It really depends on which version of T-72. So it's a bit like M1. T-72 has been around for nearly 50 years now, actually a little over. So an earlier T-72 is nowhere near as capable as a later T-72. You wouldn't expect it. In 91, when Challenger 1 was facing off against T-72s, they were not great T-72s. They didn't use good ammunition. So the fact that Challenger 1 was a little bit older, using an older gun, the L11, it didn't matter. The Challenger was better than the T-72. If you move that to a modern vehicle, the Challenger 2 with the L30 gun, and you go up against a more modern T-72, let's say one in the last 10 years, you're still looking at the Challenger 2 being a better tank. So again, though, it all comes down to how it's used. You can have the best equipment in the world, but if you're not using it correctly, if you don't have a crew that knows what it's doing, and the supporting structure, both in terms of the sustainment and the infantry and artillery fighting alongside it, then those advantages, or the theoretical advantages of the tank, don't apply because you're not using it to the extent of its capability, its assets.
And Putin has previously picked out specific weapons that have been fielded by Ukraine, that have been given to them by the West. For example, he recently said they were going to sort of knock down, they were saying, the Patriot missile as soon as it arrived in Ukraine. Do you think that the Challenger could become kind of targeted by Russian forces if it ever arrived in Ukraine? And how much of an obstacle would it be for the Russians?
I don't think it'll be directly targeted because, I mean, you're only going to shoot at what's available to you. And if a Challenger 2 happens to come up against a Russian anti-tank team, the Russian anti-tank team will shoot at a Challenger 2 just as if it would shoot against a T-64, a T-72, or anything else that happens to walk into its sights. The problem they're going to have is it's pretty damn tough to knock out a Challenger 2. That said, they may what we call a mobility kill. I mean, if you hit the Challenger 2 on the tracks, the crew are fine, the vehicle can be repaired, but it's still out of the fight until you can get it fixed. So then you have the question, and this is an old time-honored question of, if you have a choice of targets to shoot at, the Challenger 2 or the T-64s, which one do you shoot at? Do you shoot at the most dangerous target in the hope that you can knock it out? Or do you shoot at a still quite dangerous target, such as a T-64, in the greater chance that you will at least knock that out and reduce the firepower coming at you? And, I mean, that's one of those mission, terrain, time specific questions that you just have to deal with on the fly. But are you saying, are the Russians going to try to satellite view the Challenger 2 and send rockets at them? No, I don't see that happening.
There was, I believe, a few years ago, there was a leak regarding the Challenger 2 from the UK, specifically to Russia. I'm not sure if you're aware of that or not. Did you read that news article at the time? Or
are you talking about that one that was published on a computer game forum?
Might be the one, yeah. It was. I think it was only regarding something like an operating handbook. But could that be significant? Will the Russians be using that sort of information against any Western assets that come in?
Realistically, no. That leak, if I recall, was something to do with the mount of the L-30. There's sort of very technical information that when you're shooting at a tank, okay, what do you do with this information? I'm shooting at a tank. I'm going to aim center mass at a tank. I'm going to shoot it. I'm going to try to kill it. And, I mean, even if they had the entire operator's handbook, what are you going to do with it? I mean, I'm going to capture a Challenger 2 and then use it? If the Ukrainians are going to have trouble with 10, I'm sure the Russians will have trouble with 1. That leak of information I don't think is at all relevant in the tactical sense of being able to be used against